Welcome back to Second Breakfast and our ongoing Game of Thrones coverage, bringing you the best thoughts, theories, and literary analysis this side of River Run.
Right before we started recording this, Cam goes, where does this battle take place? So we can make sure we got it right.
Well, I know it's in the woods, but who can say? So yeah, another week, another battle. We're really hitting a fever pitch as we come towards the grand finale of this first book. And this is interesting because we know Ned is right about to die. We've been saying that for most of a year now.
I was going to say, most of the time we've been reading this book.
But I think we can say it in a slightly different way now. Because this is Catelyn chapter 10 that we're talking about today. And correct me if I'm wrong down in the comments, or Maggie, feel free.
I love correcting you, more than anything.
I believe we've only had 10 Ned chapters?
I think we've had 11.
Okay. Because that was our number one POV. We had more chapters of him than anyone else. And in my mind, this Catelyn chapter was tying that record.
I see. No, sorry. Cam, I'm sorry to tell you, we've had 15 Neds.
Really?
15.
You know,
but I don't think...
we're 5 years into this. In the early days, I would have started over recording at this point.
No, let's keep it in.
But I'm going to leave it in.
I like that.
I can pivot on a dime here. I think it's interesting that she's getting to this milestone.
I was going to say, I don't think anybody else has gotten to 10 yet.
No.
Like, except for Ned, obviously. So, still, it tracks. You're fine.
This might be more of my stupidity, but when I think about all of these books, in my head, it's like everyone gets roughly 10 chapters. And I know it's always way more or less than that. It's never that clean. It's like you get 2 oddballs and everyone else gets like 7.
Yeah, right.
But I love that Catelyn gets to 10 here because I do think we're wrapping up arcs now. And when we get to my thoughts on the chapter, I want to talk about it in concert with the previous couple weeks. And I think you're going to dive into the text more instead of that kind of structural viewpoint. So I'm really excited to talk about that.
Sure.
But before we do that, Maggie, what happened in this chapter? Spoilers for the book and the show.
Let me tell you, it's very quick. This is a Game of Thrones Catelyn number 10. Cat is waiting in the woods with some soldiers. Basically, she is with Robb and his army, and they're going to ambush Jaime Lannister and his army. Remember, last chapter, Tywin Lannister fought an army of Starks, but Robb was not with them. So this is Robb and his half. So they're about to ambush Jaime, and Jaime's army approaches. And so Cat basically everybody goes off to go fight this battle. Cat, of course, does not participate in the battle. She is, a lady. She's not trained in combat, so she stays behind, like with her little guard. And it's really cool. This chapter is only like 6 pages, but we basically get to, through her, POV, she hears the battle. She can't see it, but she's like listening. And so this battle unfolds, and the Starks win. And not only that, but when Robb comes back, he brings with him Jaime Lannister. They have captured the Kingslayer. It's very exciting. And Cat demands that Jaime give her back her father, her brother, her daughters, and her husband, her entire family. And Jaime cheekily refuses. And Theon says, we should kill him. We should cut his head off. He sucks. And Robb's like, no. We should keep him. He'll be more useful to us alive than dead. Also, it's kind of rude to just kill somebody randomly after a battle. Daddy always said never to do that.
I think we're past the point of rudeness, but yeah.
It's like it's not honorable to do that. So he doesn't. Sure. But mostly it's Jaime's helpful alive. And so they've captured him, and that's great. And they're all, pleased they won the battle, but Cat and both Robb sort of like remind everybody, hey, this is just the beginning. We still have Lord Tywin to deal with. This is not over. We've won the battle, but not the war. And that's where we end it. Real quick.
An incredible chapter. It's such a great experience. I think there's less to analyze than in some other chapters that are more about subtext and character, but this one is just such a showcase for George R.R. Martin. It reminded me of my what has aged in my head to become my very favorite Tolkien chapter, which is that, we talk about this all the time, it's that Shelob introduction.
Yeah.
That's so much about these flashes where you see fragments of her and you kind of build this collage or tapestry in your mind before you see, like you do in the movie, big spider filling out the screen.
Right.
You see these flashes and these pieces in that kind of Hitchcocky way that makes it so much more suggestive and inspiring. It engages your imagination. The way this leaned on that like sensory deprivation with sound, I thought was equally powerful and impressive.
Yeah, I really liked it. Both of those chapters are very like visceral, and you feel like you're there with the characters. Tolkien didn't do that often, but when he did it really well.
But I think that restraint is part of why it was so effective.
Yes, because you were like, oh, he's got these chops in him. It's really exciting. Same with like the chapter where they fight the Balrog and stuff. Like those Man, those chapters were good.
If I can redeem myself for my earlier stupidity from the opening of the episode, I figured out what it was when you were doing the recap.
Oh, okay.
It's because I write, on my little pages of notes at the beginning, I always write the name of the POV and then the number for, which chapter it is for them.
Right.
I do that in Roman numerals. Mm-hmm. And I knew in my head that Ned was the only POV I'd ever written the X
with the
for.
X. Yeah, that's totally
so
fair.
I knew this was the second character I was doing the X for.
Well, you were still right. It still worked out. I'm proud of you.
Still stupid, but stupid in context is half credit.
So even though I gave us a recap of the chapter, the thing that I kind of fixated on, I didn't mention the recap because it's not really plot important, but it is like analysis, character important. So before the battle kicks off, Catelyn's having a little think. Sometimes George does this. He like dives into a character's head, especially early on in the books when we're getting like context and world building, where we sort of zoom in on a character's thoughts and they're reflecting on a memory or a dream or something that happened in the past, and that helps us understand what's going on. And here, Catelyn is sort of reflecting on all of the men in her life who have made her wait. She's thinking about her father who, when she was a kid would say, wait for me until I come back from battle or whatever. And we learn that the running theme through all these men, like her brother, her father, her Brandon Stark, who's Ned's brother, who was going to be her husband, and now Ned, and now Rob, they make her wait, but also they break promises. Like they make promises to her that they end up not keeping. So for her father, the broken promise is, I'll come back, but it says that he did not always come back when he said he would. The promise that Brandon Stark makes to her is, I shall not be long, my lady. We will be wed on my return. Of course, he dies and they are not wed, and she weds Ned instead. The promise that Ned breaks, not in actuality, but according to Ned and in Catelyn's understanding of reality, Ned breaks his marriage vow by having Jon. Of course, that's not true, but nobody else knows that. So Catelyn thinks that promise was also broken. And then Rob here has not broken any promises yet, but we know that he has made promises that he will eventually break, mainly that he's going to marry Walder Frey's daughter. And we've pointed out with Rob quite a lot the number of times he's made promises that he's not going to keep. He promises to Jon that he's going to see him again soon. He promises, I forget what else, but this man can't keep a promise. And it's like, I don't fault him for it. When I say all these things, I don't mean that these men are disloyal or dishonorable or liars. It's more that they make promises or vows that are not able to be kept because of circumstances, and it's like all the more tragic.
Yeah, she seems to have sympathy for them, because when you introduce that thesis of here are all the men in my life who don't keep their promises or have let me down or made me wait, when she started listing them off, I was so expecting for Littlefinger to be on the list.
Ooh, interesting.
Because he's such a liar, because he's a promise breaker, but he's malicious. And I agree, none of these guys mean to break their promises, and she does love them despite these things that are beyond their control.
Yes, like she's not like being like, ugh, all these men have wronged me. Like that's not what she's thinking about. It's just like, wow, things are really hard.
It's melancholy. I have to sit here and my son might go off to die right now. I know he's 15 inexperienced. My husband might be dead. My father might be dead. My brother might be. It's much more of a melancholy than like an airing of grievances.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I was trying to figure out what that's really accomplishing here in the chapter, other than it's interesting and a good bit of a good way to describe without it describing Catelyn's melancholy like you're identifying. But I think the thing that sort of connected it for me was this prayer that Catelyn mutters to herself right before Rob goes out, or as he's gone out, I can't remember. She says she's noticing how tall he looks. He's only 15 and he feels so tall. And then she thinks to herself, let him grow taller, she asks the gods. Let him know 16 and 20 and 50. Let him grow tall as his father and hold his own son in his arms. Please, please, please. And we know that this plea that she's asking for, I think except for making it to 16, none of that's going to come true. Rob's not going to make it to 20 or 50 or get to hold his son in his arms. And so it's like even the gods can't fulfill a promise to Catelyn. Like there's nothing, like everything that Catelyn wants or that, is promised to her by men or that the men around her could accomplish can't be accomplished. And so like she can't even find connection with the gods. And my connection point here is the very first line of this chapter reminded me a lot of the first line of the first Catelyn chapter way back at the beginning of the book. The beginning of this chapter opens on the sentence, "The woods were full of whispers." And then it goes into this beautiful description of woods. The first line of Catelyn's first chapter is, Catelyn had never liked this god's wood. And then it goes into a beautiful description of woods.
You remembered that off the dome?
Yes, I was like, this is familiar. And it's like a singular sentence in its own paragraph.
Yeah.
And then it goes on to something else. And I was like, that's curious. And every time that kind of thing happens, I'm like, okay, well, it could be that George has writing quirks that he likes and sticks to because he knows they're effective. And that's part of it, sure. But I thought, let's play with it. It's fun. And I was interested in, when it's talking about the Godswood, she doesn't like the Godswood. That's when we learn all about, she's from the South. She doesn't worship the old god. She worships the 7 gods. Like, she's got a whole different system. And here, even though she's back in her hometown, her home place, she's near River Run. She's in the land of the 7 and not the old gods. She's still so disconnected from the gods, from getting what she wants from them. And I like that the text doesn't specify which god she's praying to. I mean, presumably she's praying to the 7. Those are the gods she worships, but she's a Stark. And even in the last couple of Catelyn chapters, I think we've talked a lot about how much she's leaning into her Stark identity and like sort of taking on the role that Ned would normally have, but he can't because he's in a dungeon. And so if she's leaning into that Stark part of her, presumably she would also be leaning into the old gods. And so here again, we've got a disconnect between Catelyn and the old gods. These men around her can't keep promises. The gods won't keep promises to her. And so it almost feels to me like the text is sort of telling us that the Starks are sort of on this divine level, fated and doomed. Like, what they want can't happen. What they're hoping for won't be achieved. And the gods are sort of orchestrating that. And I don't think George is ever suggesting that the gods in this world are really manipulating things in the way that the god of Middle-earth did in Tolkien, for example. Like, there's a lot more human free will that's making things happen. So the gods seem to be operating more on like a really like large scale, sort of like 30,000 foot view of like, the Starks can't win. Like, how that happens is up to the people on the earth, but the gods sort of seem to be allowing that or directing things in that way. Do you get that sense?
Yeah, no, I do, because when I read that version of the prayer that she kind of mutters to herself, or maybe it's even in her head, the first thing I thought of was that Roose Bolton line of the young wolf forever young. And that to me, in this context, and I love the way you kind of set it up there, of all of these cascading disappointments throughout her life from all of these men and then also from the gods. That line from Roose Bolton almost feels like he's speaking with the voice of the old gods.
Yeah.
I mean, I know it's sort of a trite line, but the man plans, God laughs thing.
Sure.
I feel like that Roose Bolton line is kind of the gods of Westeros and the old gods answering that prayer.
Yeah, I like
and
that.
And brushing it aside. Because I agree, it is more of a macro thing. They're not moving the chess pieces around individually like the god of Middle-earth can be said to invade parts of the narrative.
Right, yeah. It's more like the gods here are sort of in charge of like big picture, like what's the final result? How it happens is up to the people, is up to the families, the houses, the different things. But like, here's a little dash of prophecy. Here's a little dash of like, the Starks can't win or something like that. Like, that's sort of what I'm getting. And what's even more fun about that is there's like an element in here that complicates the whole thing, because I feel like we're getting a similar thing with the Lannisters too. So there's a moment when they're waiting in the woods and they can see Jaime and some of his men walking by, and it's just for a minute, but like they can see them and Jaime doesn't know that they're there. Obviously, it says that the moonlight had silvered Jaime. The moonlight had silvered his armor and gold of his hair and turned his crimson cloak to black. So when you think about the Lannisters, you think of gold and crimson. And even last chapter, we got like 18 descriptions of Tywin and how brightly shiny gold he was and his, rich, ginormous crimson cloak. And that was like really, really present. He was flashing in the sunlight. It was a whole thing. And here, Jaime's sort of been demystified. He's been like unlannistered. His gold has turned to silver. His crimson has turned to black. And so it's almost like the gods are sort of hinting that the Lannisters are in a similar like fated, doomed position. And I'm connected to the gods. I don't know. Maybe it's not the gods because it says the moonlight. Mm-hmm. So the moonlight could mean winter. It could mean darkness. It could mean the Starks. I don't know quite what it means, but it feels opposite to daylight, sun, the seven. It feels like old gods to me. And so that it feels like both of these families are fated, and I don't know what we're supposed to think is going to come out of it.
See, okay, so I want to jump on that because I noticed that too. This silver thing, that really caught in my brain because he uses that word silver or variations of it way more in this chapter than we've ever heard it before.
Yeah.
Where you were just going with that, I thought you were going to say the silver hair kind of crosses streams between the Lannisters and the Targaryens.
Yeah.
If you're talking about another kind of doomed family.
That's true.
Then Jaime's becoming like that.
And their main color is black and not red. I mean,
exactly.
red is there, but
the
black
cloak,
is the biggest. Yeah.
The black and the red and then the silver hair.
Interesting.
I think that's one way you can go with it. The other way, because so much of this chapter is sneaking around woods, not knowing who you're going to see or who you're going to recognize, I think what George could be doing here is kind of a Tolkienian inversion. Because when I saw Jaime and the moonlight was almost blinding, where I couldn't recognize him or his trademark features, it almost felt like the first time we see Gandalf the White.
Oh, yeah.
When it's blinding and we don't recognize him at first, and then he's kind of this elevated or narratively promoted version of himself.
Interesting.
I thought George was going the other way and giving Jaime a narrative demotion.
Yes.
Where he was reducing him to be just one of the soldiers, one of the men on the field.
Yes.
And by the end of the chapter, when he's dragged through the mud and beat up and wounded and bleeding and kidnapped, he is being treated just like everyone else. So I thought that was sort of the inverse of the Gandalf the White.
I like that. And it could be that, like Catelyn says at the end of this chapter, we've won the battle, but not the war. Like, let's not celebrate too much here. Let's focus on our next step, which is getting Tywin, reclaiming River Run, that kind of thing. And it feels like Catelyn she's using that, macro vision of things, but she's not zooming out enough. She's missing all of these hints about, like, Rob's not going to make it to 20. He's not going to make it to 50. Like, she's missing the big picture stuff that the gods seem to be controlling of the Starks are doomed, the Starks are fated. So, yeah, you're being the Lannisters right now. Maybe Winter or the old gods might be helping you with that in the short term. But long term, it's not going to work out for you because long term, the Lannisters are going to orchestrate the murder of her and Rob and his unborn child and wife. So it's like she kind of misses her own advice there.
But for a chapter that begins with a list of men who've broken promises, it's interesting that then Jaime pops out of the woods because he's addressed multiple times through this chapter as Kingslayer.
Right.
His defining quality is breaking not just a promise, but a vow.
A sacred vow. Yeah, that's really true.
So he becomes this kind of test case for Catelyn, because you could go at it from that traditional kind of grimdark analysis and say, hey, all of the noble men in Catelyn's life, they're all either dead or dying, and you have to be like Jaime to survive. But then by the end of the chapter, Jaime has lost and is captured and most likely about to be killed.
Yeah, right.
So it muddies the waters again. I never think that grimdark tag fits comfortably on this series. And I think this chapter is kind of a beautiful undermining or complication of that idea.
Yeah, totally. Because you see all these characters constantly grappling with the grim darkness of it all, but there's not like one clean takeaway of, well, you just got to be a cheater to win. Like, it's not nearly that simple. And you can see them all struggling with that and never quite knowing where to land. It's really fascinating. This chapter was really beautiful to read. I had a good time.
I really like that. I love the things you wrote in there, doing some kind of in the weeds analysis. I want to zoom out and do some more structural stuff, because
great.
that's kind of where this chapter hit for me. Mainly, I was thinking about the last chapter, the Tyrion chapter that we covered last week, where we see his POV through the other half of this battle. And unlike in the show, he's not knocked out immediately, so there was much more for us to play with in that last discussion.
Saw the whole thing. It was so fun.
But the contrast, the juxtaposition of this chapter next to that last chapter, they are our first two big battles, maybe our first three battles if you rope in the previous Dany chapter.
Right.
Which is her on the margins of the Dothraki really blowing through this group of like sheep herders. My first observation is that we get indirect, unlikely, ancillary POVs for all three of these battles, while the traditional battle-tested heroes are all relegated to the margins. So in Dany's chapter, Khal Drogo is at best a supporting character or a cameo.
Yeah.
Last chapter, Tywin is barely seen. He's relegated to the sides. And here, Jaime is just thrown in there at the end.
You don't even see Robb either. Like Robb,
No.
Robb is successful in the battle, but we don't get to see anything from his POV. And he's in there only so much as Kat is noticing him. Yeah.
So the question I want to play with is that next step of analysis. It's the thing we always default to. Why?
Mm-hmm.
So what?
So
Who
what?
cares?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I think there are a couple different options here. So I'll throw them out there just to popcorn and see what you think of them.
Okay.
My first hunch is that maybe this is some sort of statement of intent or authorial posture. Because the reader, us, I guess, we're on the margins of this massive ensemble cast of characters. So it would make sense that we only get this kind of fractal or partial view of these big battles. Because we're so invested in the characters that we do see. Even if, say we use, I don't know, Battle of the Bastards or something.
Sure.
Even if you were with Jon, I feel like it would have to be a 200-page chapter for us to get that level of intimacy and proximity through a big, scary battle compared to the intimacy and proximity we get for Jon walking through the rookery with Maester Aemon.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So I feel like with the way he's telling this story, there's not a way to translate that cleanly to these battles. So maybe that's why he's throwing these curveballs, because we're on the margins, and to do the thing properly would be half the book.
Interesting.
I don't know.
That's an interesting
Maybe?
idea. But I see what you're saying, but I don't think that any of the other events in the book are approached from the margins. We feel like I feel very in it on every other plot point. If it's a small council meeting, if it's a conversation with Maester Luwin, if it's a dream, if it's a horrible situation that Dany's dealing with,
because those things are all more linear and smaller scale.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That's an interesting idea. I think I would feel more confident about it if our characters were more on the margins, but they really aren't. Like, we've talked about this before. Mm-hmm. We don't follow any of the kings. We don't follow Joffrey, Robert, Robb, Stannis. Like, we don't follow any of the kings, at least not in these first few books. Yeah. But none of the characters we follow are on the margins. So, I mean, you're onto something, but I want to hear your other options.
Well, let me explain it this way. There was, I don't know why I just thought of this. There was a kind of carousel type thing when I was young, but there was also, if you reached out your arm, you could grab for a ring. I know my brother Samron, my sister Sam, is listening to this and punching the wall right now because she knows exactly what I'm trying to describe. Okay. And I'm sure I've got 10% of it.
You're talking on a playground?
I don't know. I'm on some sort of horse or something. There's some seat. The point is, I'm reaching out for a ring.
Okay.
And they're these brass metal rings. Okay. And occasionally in there, because it's just a little machine that pops one out so everyone can try to grab them. And then this is what it is. Okay. You grab the ring and then you throw them at something, and it's kind of like the Buzz Lightyear thing at Disney World, where you throw the rings, and there's a big clown mouth, and there's a hole in the mouth.
And this is a whole setup. Okay.
You throw the rings. It's like a ring toss, maybe. Okay. Through the parts of the.
Okay.
Anyway,
this is the thing you did as a kid.
Occasionally, there's a gold ring.
Oh.
And if you bring a gold ring to an employee, you get something special.
Okay, cool.
So it's that idea of you're kind of grasping at the experience, and you can only get a piece of a little of it. I think maybe it's... in the way
that you can only get a piece of the larger story, because even if you're getting it from 10 different characters, even still, that's just a piece of everything.
Yeah, and we do have this kind of kaleidoscopic view of Westeros, because we're constantly spelunking into these different perspectives and lives. The thing that really sticks with me from the Game of Thrones show is the first 30 seconds of Battle of the Bastards, where you think Jon, he draws the sword and it's slow-mo and it's clean. You understand what's happening. And then the two walls of horses meet and it's just chaos. Right. And it's flashes of things that are incomprehensible and inexplicable and overwhelming. And you have to cut away to different things. If we had just followed his POV, movies try to do this like 1917. It's almost impossible to just capture that experience. So maybe if George's perspective on this world is this kind of kaleidoscopic, constantly jumping between POVs, maybe we can get a bigger piece of the pie. We can reach for the ring toss better if we're looking at these battles from these outside, more still perspectives. Because it's a difference between It's a difference. I know I'm just jumping through metaphors. I'll find one I'm happy with. It's a difference between like Steadicam and handheld.
Right.
And like the Jason Bourne movies, they're all shaky in the car crash. Like we can kind of mount a camera with Catelyn on the margins, with Dany on the margins, with Tyrion, who's kind of given this shitty side command, and we can get a real piece of the battle versus this just kaleidoscope mess, chaos of following someone who's directly participating.
Sure. Yeah. And you know, I think a good thing to notice is that the closest we get to like really in the middle of it, in the thick of it, battle POV is Tyrion, because you're right. He is on this sort of like side mission within the battle, but even still, like the descriptions of him being in that battle are so chaotic that it's hard for us and Tyrion to see the big picture and know what's going on. We don't really understand the results of the battle until after, when he goes and talks with Tywin, who was watching it on a hill from above. So yeah, I think you're right. If we were constantly in that, like in the middle of it all, trying to understand things like battles, it would be really complicated and hard.
I think the second explanation here might be that George is just building up this idea. He's kind of building up our experience with these battles towards the bigger battles that we will get to down the line in the series, where we're slowly building our experience and fear almost one sense at a time, where this chapter is so much about the sound. In the same way, Dany, if we are counting that Dany chapter as a battle chapter,
I think we should.
That was about the sound of the assault victims.
Right, the aftermath.
That was what engaged her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that was sort of the lens that she saw that battle through. We don't know if she actually saw the battle itself.
Right.
But it was a limited kind of sensory deprivation experience after the battle. And that's how we, following along with her, also saw the battle. And then Tyrion, of course, is more traditional. But even that is... He's marginalized during the conflict. He's given this side command. So maybe we're building up all of these disparate experiences so that by the time we get to a Hardhome or a Blackwater at the end of the next book, maybe we'll get the full fat experience.
Right. I mean, and the sound even plays a big role in the Tyrion chapter. There's like a big fixation on, like a big focusing on the sound of the horns from the different sides and how like haunting the Stark's horn is and how exciting and invigorating the Lannister horn is and like how much it really gets to Tyrion.
Yeah.
So, and it's sort of, he kind of has that moment of, like anybody does in like a really like either like intense or overwhelming or traumatic experience, is like your senses kind of like fixate and zoom in. So I think that's interesting across those. Yeah.
So maybe he's building up that it's almost like classical music where you introduce themes and then you evolve them and you cross them with each other and you introduce. And I mean, you know this more than I do because you've played an instrument for a long time, but maybe we're getting those first movements of a larger piece where he's working with sound, and then maybe we'll see some sort of conflict through a different sense. And by the time we get to a big battle, we'll be firing with all five senses at once.
Sure. It's almost like he's building up our tolerance for reading a battle chapter.
Sure.
Because so far we haven't gotten that. Like we've gotten moments of conflict and violence, but it's like one-to-one, and it's not on a big battle scale. So that's interesting.
The third explanation, this is my last and probably favorite interpretation here, is that George R. R. Martin is incredibly well-versed in fantasy and that he's just trying to do something new in not only an oversaturated genre, but also the most expected part of the fantasy genre, the expected finale of a big battle. I think it's interesting because this was written so long before it even reached the kind of cultural relevance of the HBO show.
Right.
Where the level of subverting expectations, all these phrases that have become kind of sneering cliches, he was doing Subversion before it was a cliche.
Yeah,
so you have to take it at face value and respect the creativity of it. I think he's just getting creative. Like if you look at the outcome of this battle versus how you set up this battle in a traditional fantasy POV, we're watching a battle from the hero's mom's POV on the sidelines.
And she can't even see it.
She can't see anything that's happening. And the knight in shining armor, not only is he pure evil, but he also loses and is captured.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I like that. I mean, it's like the least, like, in terms of like the story and symbolically, it's the least interesting in that way. But I think it's also really, it's a valid thing, is you want to tell your story in a creative way. And you're absolutely right. I mean, I've said 1,000 times, I get bored when I read battles because I'm like, oh, the arrows and the horses. But this was such a lovely reading experience because I was so in it with Catelyn. I felt like I was like listening hard with her. I wanted to like block out everything else and see if I could listen for the details of the battle too. I was worried for her son as much as she was worried for him. Like, I think that's a much more effective way to tell your story. So yeah, I love it.
And as much as we're calling these things subversions, when I compare them back to Tolkien, specifically the experience of reading the books, which you and I, of course, did chapter by chapter, that's how this whole thing started, the best Tolkien battles are not Aragorn leading the charge into battle.
Mm-hmm.
It's Pelennor Fields,
right?
Which is following a hobbit with a tiny sword and a woman who's not supposed to be there.
Right, yeah. That's the best, yeah.
The legends of this genre have even subverted that expectation.
Sure.
Which makes you kind of wonder at this point where the expectation's coming from. But it's almost a Tolkienian thing that he's doing.
Yes.
By not following the hero into battle, by not having him meet the knight in shining armor in single combat. Like,
and sometimes when Tolkien does write battles, like I think of the Battle of the Five Armies in The Hobbit, number one, he barely goes
it's a paragraph.
He barely goes into any detail, but he's telling it from such a 30,000 foot view, POV, bird's eye view, that it's not interesting to read about. Like, it's an interesting thing that happens, and you're like, you understand it on that level, but it doesn't. That I don't remember a single detail from that battle other than what the movies added in, So yeah, when he does do it that way, that's when it's most effective. And George has clearly recognized that and is doing it in that way. And again, I just think the mirroring between this and the first Catelyn chapter of her being in the woods and receiving bad news and trying to figure out what to do next with the oldest, closest male member of her family, it's an interesting comparison, and I really, really like it.
But yeah, that was just kind of open-ended.
Yeah.
I just wanted to throw out those three ideas, but I'm very interested to hear what you guys think of this.
Totally.
Why was this chapter placed here, and why was it written in this way?
Yeah.
What do you, like, going past the initial observation to the why? Why was this chapter done this way? Why were these subversions everywhere? Why were we on the margins?
For sure. And not to we have to come to the correct answer. No. Everybody, ask George and have him give us an answer. It's just interesting to think about.
It's interpretation. There is no correct
right.
answer.
And I'm looking forward to whatever our next battle is, which I don't even know, and seeing what sort of POV does he take, what approach does he take for that one, just continue to track this.
I don't think our next battle will be in this book.
I don't think so. I can't.
It's probably Blackwater.
I can't fucking remember. But yeah, it's probably not for a while, so I don't know. But yeah, so that's fun. This was a good chapter. I really liked it.
Oh, yeah. Again, it was more of an experiential chapter, but if you haven't read it, it's 6 pages. It's absolutely incredible.
It's lovely. Do you know what we have next, Cam?
Danny.
Oh, yeah. We're going right back to Danny. We talked about this last Danny chapter. Our Targaryen checkpoints as we know them have are sort of gone, and now we're doing a lot of Danny, but wow, we're already back, and I'm excited to see how badly Khal Drogo deteriorates. So I guess join us next week for more of this, where we could catch up with Danny. This was fun. Thank you all for listening. Did you guys know we have a Patreon? I'm sure you do. We have a Patreon. It's $2 a month. You can support the show and also get access to a whole range of bonus episodes. We put out a new bonus episode once a month, sometimes twice or thrice, or what's 4 times a month.
Quattro.
Quattrice. I took 3 semesters of Latin. I don't remember shit, so it's fine. We've got lots in there. You can check that out. Also, check out Cam's latest book, Lemon Tarts in Space. It's available as a novel in paperback form or as an audio drama. It's a rip-roaring ride through space and time. Ridley Scott's Alien meets Monty Python. It's a good time. Thank you for your support. Otherwise, this past Tuesday, right? No. The Tuesday before this past Tuesday, our recording order.
This past Tuesday.
No, because
we will have just done our Valentine's Day special.
Okay, I was going to talk about Red Rooms. That was 2 weeks ago. Red Rooms was great. Go check that out. But this past Tuesday, we released our Valentine's special talking about Challengers, one of the best love stories ever made. We, for some reason, never did an episode on that movie when it came out last year, but we loved it and we wanted to talk about it. So go check it out. As always, thank you for your support, and we'll see you on Tuesday with another brand new episode.